A Bookkeeper's Guide to Practical Sorcery by Kate Russell is an epic fantasy of courage and friendship, passion and ingenuity. Aimed at the young adult market, it will grip readers of all ages. Its protagonist, Henry M.A.B.L.E, has a heavy load to bear, as his family's protector and breadwinner. His father vanished in mysterious circumstances, leaving him the reluctant champion of two obnoxious younger siblings. Henry counts gold for a living, day in, day out, and what a boring job that is. His mind wanders into dreams of magic and wizardry. His chance appears. Does he grab it with both hands? You betcha! Does it all work out just fine? Hell no. He's pitched into a world of treachery and deceit. When Henry is forced to set out on a terrifying journey, it is his timid friend Peter at his side. Neither of them wants to admit it, but they both wish fervently that the fearless DC is with them. But in this world, things don't work out the way anyone wants or expects. You'll laugh, you'll shriek, you'll gasp with fear, but this book will cast a spell on you, and you won't be able to put it down.
I've just had fun reading a book by Kate Russell called The Bookkeeper's Guide to Practical Sorcery. Now, you'll guess from the title that this is a comic fantasy book, but it's a rich story and the entertainment value is great. How do you summarize the story? Well, not easily. Something like this. Since his father disappeared on a trading mission, Henry M.A.B.L.E, a teenager, has become the family's breadwinner for his mother and younger brothers. Younger brothers are terrible twins, whoever they were. He works as a bookkeeper in the king's castle under the supervision of the ultimate in horrible bosses, Mr. Colloyd. I love that name. Henry is a quick learner, but his friend Halcyon, who is the sorcerer royal, an elderly man, is reluctant to help him achieve his aspiration. You see, Henry wants to become a wizard. But when Halcyon learns that Henry has started to attend classes run by the gormandizing enterprises, an enterprise for which the word rip-off was surely invented, Halcyon relents. And our teenage protagonist starts to receive lessons in wizardry that are actually worthwhile. And then Halcyon disappears. And Henry eludes the pursuing castle guards who think of something to do with it to seek out the evil in the dark forest. Well, what a story. Yes, Henry has two companions. There's DC, who is a woman about his own age, whose friendship is about the only good thing to emerge from his contact with gormandizing enterprises, and Peter, who is another of Mr. Colloyd's minions. DC is borderline crazy, much more knowledgeable than Henry, but hopelessly impractical. Peter, on the other hand, is highly rational, but scared of everything, including his own shadow. There are so many things to love about this novel. It's fun, it holds the attention, although for me at least the first 2 or 3 chapters are challenging until we've fully entered the world of the story. The author has used her experience as a journalist and her knowledge of gaming to great effect. Her names and situations are hilarious, as in the examples I've quoted. And there are oblique references to contemporary society and politics. There's a sort of comparison with the late Sir Terry Pratchett, but Kate Russell's writing style is quite different from his. There are twists, and then there are double twists. The way in which Kate Russell offers us scientific explanations for magic actually had me laughing out loud. Henry and his companions are steadfast and determined, but their inexperience shows, and they make the most hilarious blunders. There's only one nasty baddie in the book, but that nasty baddie beats a suitably satisfying fate. A brilliant read.
The headline: Accountants denied crumpet to market the boss. I had to do a double take when I first picked up this book. Kate Russell, Practical Sorcery. Wait a minute. I knew Kate Russell as a broadcaster, a presenter on BBC Click, someone who campaigned for women in STEM. She gave a really powerful TED talk called Girls Don't Game in 2014. I couldn't fit either bookkeeping or sorcery, practical or impractical, into my mental image. But it turned out that along with all the other stuff she's done and the books she's written, Kate Russell had indeed written a young adult adventure called A Bookkeeper's Guide to Practical Sorcery. So of course I couldn't wait to dive in. Now, this isn't a book review, so I'm not going to tell you too much about this Bookkeeper's Guide, but I will note that it's dramatic, scary, funny, moving, and ultimately a very satisfying read. Kate Russell's background clearly informs the way things work within the world she's created. It's aimed at young adults, but it has layers to it. And you can see the humour come straight through from her adult novel, Elite Mostly Harmless. There are places in the Bookkeeper's Guide where I think all age groups are going to laugh, but for different reasons. So, it's not a book review, what is it? Well, I was just given the opportunity. I'm just delving into the Spotlight books for the massive autumn book launch event. And I've picked on one aspect that's both integral to the main plot of this book, but also sitting slightly aside from it. Something that's intrigued me from my very first reading of A Bookkeeper's Guide to Practical Sorcery. All that gold. This is the question I asked Kate Russell. Henry's workplace in the vaults is reminiscent of 19th century banks with their rooms full of young clerks working long hours. It also echoes off accounts of Victorian London workplaces that the gold needs such assiduous and continual counting. Turnover must be brisk. Is this to do with high finance in a pre-technological society? Or is it helped along by industrial scale money laundering on the part of the bad guys? And here's what Kate told me in reply. The official line is that running a kingdom is a very complex business that requires a lot of movement of funds coming in and out. People pay taxes, there's income from the estates, there are workers to pay, and rare ingredients to buy from distant lands. However, anyone who's met a king or a queen will know they love nothing better than to boast about their wealth to visiting dignitaries. There is no better way to do this without seeming gauche than a tour of the vaults, with table upon table of glittering piles of gold on display. So for the most part, people in the know believe the expansively staffed castle vaults are nothing more than a marketing exercise. In fact, the accountants could just as well be at home, enjoying a nice toasted crumpet with strawberry jam, and the kingdom would run just as effectively as when they sit there counting gold over and over again. This could explain why most accountants look so miserable while they're at work, and so contented while eating strawberry jam on toasted crumpet.
A Bookkeeper's Guide to Practical Sorcery. Written by Kate Russell. Performed by Charles Collingwood. Chapter 1. Do you believe in magic? I see you pause for thought. Perhaps to ponder, what is magic anyway? Where is the proof of it around me? But why must you see a thing for it to be real? Can you see the air you breathe? Deny its existence if you like, but it will go on filling your lungs regardless. Magic, let me tell you, friend, is just as real. It flows across the earth as blood flows through your veins. You don't believe me? I see it in your eyes, the tolerant look of someone humouring a fool. But I hope to change your mind tonight, because unlike blood and the air that you breathe, magic does need faith to exist. Not much, just a trickle of belief from a special few. Like the hidden roots of a cactus drawing life from deep below the desert floor. I wonder if your mind is open enough to become one of those roots, ensuring for another generation that magic survives. I'd like to tell you a tale, if I may, about a time when magic would have died were it not for one brave soul who fought a monster to save it. Perhaps you'll think it's a pleasant story and go on your way, your life unchanged. But I see more than that in your eyes. I see a deeper understanding that hints at something special. So sit, be comfy as we travel, friend. Perhaps my tale will sow in you the seed of belief that magic needs to keep blooming. Henry Noble wasn't a particularly remarkable-looking young man. Small for his age, with a thoughtful face, the kind of face you'd skim right past if you were looking for trouble. Each morning, at 6:15, he would pick up his lunch pail from the faded kitchen table, kiss his mother's cheek goodbye, and stride down the garden path out through the neat little gate that leads onto the rest of the world. At the end of the road, he would turn right onto Market Street, skirting the shiny cobbles of the square, before winding his way west through rows of cheerfully fronted cottages towards the looming stone walls of the castle. Henry loved the square at this time of day. The worn trestles and empty stalls, still naked of burgeoning produce, stood in tidy ranks that seemed to march purposefully towards the frowning grey castle above. The cobbles glistened in the early morning emptiness, polished to an impossible sheen each day by a stampede of hungry bargain hunters. Henry paused to enjoy the scene as a swifttail looped down out of the clear blue sky to snag some morsel overlooked by nighttime scavengers. In the distance, he heard the faint echo of hooves and cartwheels as the first of the day's traders began making their bleary way to their stations. Henry's walk to the castle wasn't very long, 20 minutes at most, but he liked to allow enough time to stop by the north wing on his way to work. This majestic stone tower was home to Halcyon, the Wizard Royal, and Henry's only true friend. Together they would sit and drink tea, chatting about the comings and goings in Terratonia. But the conversation always ended up in the same neighbourhood. "I need you to teach me, Halcyon. I can't go on like this. It's killing me inside." As usual, Henry's face was the picture of misery as he sat across the table from the wise old sorcerer. "You know I don't do that any more, boy." The old man stood, leaning on the back of the chair, so he could reach a large clay jar labelled biscuits down off the shelf. "But it's so unfair. I've dreamed of this my whole life, and instead I get stuck counting gold in the king's vaults." "At least you have work, dear boy, and shebbles to buy what your family needs. There are far worse fates than becoming an accountant." Henry huffed, a rosy blush rising in his cheeks. "What about my needs? Don't they count too? I'm only 16 years old. I should be chasing dreams, not stuck in a dungeon counting someone else's money." The old man smiled at the earnest face before him. Henry had always been fascinated by magic. As a small boy, he'd often come to the castle with his father, the chief accountant. At the first opportunity, the boy would slip away from the counting vaults and seek out Halcyon in his chambers. The old wizard would charge up his wand with a colourful array of spells and charms to entertain the lad, whose eyes would grow as big as dinner plates. Normally quite shy, Henry would come alive talking about how he would one day become a great and powerful sorcerer, leaping at imaginary monsters, brandishing a wooden spoon wand to demonstrate. The king's wizard would laugh and pat him on the head, turning an apple into a twirl of butterflies to the squealing delight of his small visitor. "Your family needs you right now, Henry. Dreams can come later, when the twins are older and your mother's heart has mended." Henry's cheeks flushed again, this time fueled by guilt. He looked down sheepishly and dropped a lump of sugar into his tea. "I know you're right. I'm just being selfish. I realise we're lucky the king gave me work at such a young age. Otherwise, where would we all be now? It's just I wanted so much more out of life." "Cheer up, lad. Your life is just starting. Let's have a biscuit, and you can tell me what's going on in town." Henry watched as the old man wrestled with the cork lid of the jar, which seemed determined to keep the tasty treats to itself. Realising the futility of its efforts, it popped off, flying out of Halcyon's hand to roll across the flagstone floor. Halcyon peered into the jar, smacking his lips. He stopped abruptly, his expression changing from hungry anticipation to absolute rage as he sprang to his feet and slammed the jar down on the table. "You!" he bellowed at the offending container, rifling with urgency through the folds of his robe. Henry inched back his chair, staring at the jar. The jar squeaked, and Henry saw a tiny pink nose twitch its way over the rim. The nose was followed by a small pair of paws, and a mouse, rather fat and looking very pleased with itself, started hauling its tubby body out of the jar. Halcyon managed to untangle his wand from his robe and jerked his arm outwards, blasting a ball of crackling pink light into the jar. The mouse squealed and fell back inside. Henry gripped the edge of his seat. "That troublesome rodent has been snaffling my snacks for far too long. Well, not any more." Halcyon pulled the biscuit jar towards him and reached inside. He scooped out a plump, slimy, and very cross-looking toad. "You, my rascally little friend, are going to the pond." Halcyon waggled his wand sternly at the toad. The toad burped rudely and tried to squirm out of his grasp, but the old wizard held tight before plopping it in a wooden casket on the floor. He slammed down the lid with his foot. Henry felt sorry for the mouse. A jar full of biscuits must be an awfully big temptation, and it didn't look happy about being turned into a toad. "Oh, don't worry, boy," Halcyon said, seeing Henry frown at the casket. "It's only a low-level spell. Lasts a little over a week if you get the mix right. He'll be back up here, making off with my confectionery in no time, I don't doubt." Halcyon glared at the casket. "But not before a good soaking in the pond," he said loudly, rapping the lid with his wand. Another belch came from inside. The old wizard looked pleased with himself. He sat back and pushed the jar across the table. "Biscuit?" Henry eyed the amphibious ooze now smearing the rim of the jar and shook his head. Halcyon raised his eyebrows and then dug deep for a handful of his own. "Now, where were we?" "You were reminding me my life isn't my own and refusing to teach me magic." Halcyon sighed, dunking a biscuit into his tea and swirling it around. "It's for your own good, Henry. Magic is no living, not nowadays." There was a time, many scores of years gone by, when men and women of magic had been admired and revered. The kings and queens of yesteryear would consult with their mystical consorts on affairs of state and the heart. Halcyon would stride through the cool dark corridors of the castle with his head held high, his magnificent silken robes whipping importantly at the empty space he left in his wake. But that was then, and this was now. Magic had been getting a bad name lately, and many of the best wizards had been driven into hiding, branded charlatans and fraudsters by mobs of scornful townsfolk. Halcyon was one of the lucky few. Were it not for the high regard the king's father held him in, he too would no doubt be living a lie, beating out a meagre existence as a blacksmith or a baker, his tall, pointy hat and emerald robes tucked quietly away in some dark secret cupboard. He shuddered. Besides, your mother would have my hat for a handbag if I led you off the straight and narrow. You're the head of the household, boy. Food and lodgings don't pay for themselves. Henry felt bile rise in his stomach at the injustice of it all. But if I had magic, I could spell them into existence. Or, better yet, go out and find the bandits that took my father and blast them into oblivion. Henry's fists were balled on the tabletop now. The old man reached across and patted one. I know, lad, I know. Just give it time. It's only been 2 years, and the loss is raw for all of you. But right now your family needs you. The old wizard watched the young man sadly for a moment, then remembered the biscuit dunked in his tea and pulled it out to inspect it. Henry relaxed his fists and sighed again deeply. 2 years feels like a lifetime in my shoes. At that moment, the tea-soaked biscuit decided it had also had enough of life, and a large chunk broke off the arrangement, diving headfirst back into Halcyon's cup. A droplet of tea splashed onto Henry's nose. "Oops, sorry," Halcyon said, but couldn't help smiling as Henry wiped at it crossly. "Never mind." He scraped back his chair and got up. "I should head off now. I don't want to be late. That old misery Mr. Colloyd is just looking for another excuse to dock my wages." "Very well, boy." Halcyon rose stiffly, crossing the room to open the shutters. The bright spring morning burst rudely into the dusky old chamber, transforming it instantly from an intriguing cavern filled with secrets and promise to just another stone-clad box containing a bent old man with a slightly odd dress sense. The magic was gone, and Henry should be too if he was going to buy a chicken from the market that night. He'd already been docked 5 shebels this week. If he lost much more, his brothers would be tucking into roast accountant instead of chicken, a dish his mother would be more than happy to prepare. The cool, damp corridor skirting the central courtyard was still deserted as Henry headed for the vaults, the sound of his heels tapping on cold grey flagstones echoing in a most satisfactory way. Most courtiers didn't surface before 10 o'clock, and Henry savoured these moments of peace as he wove his way through impressive chambers filled with ancient treasures. Despite the prospect of spending the next 8 hours under Mr. Colloyd's critical eye, he allowed his face to relax and try on a smile. It wasn't such a bad life, he mused, running his hand along the pleasing curve of the white stone banister leading down into his place of work. And yet he craved more. It wasn't that he disliked the people he worked with, besides his miserable boss, of course, but the only magic they believed in down here was the magic of a carefully balanced ledger, and Henry found that stifling. The chief accountant was already sitting at his desk by the door when Henry arrived. He looked pointedly at his pocket watch, unable to conceal his contempt for the young man scurrying across the room. Henry's cheeks burned as he nodded polite greetings to colleagues left and right. Mr. Colloyd squeezed the pocket watch shut and stood, his heavy oak chair screeching an ugly complaint across the floor. He tugged at the bottom of his sombre black coat and pushed steel-rimmed reading glasses even higher up on the bridge of his nose. "You are aware, Master Noble, that work begins at 8 o'clock sharp in this establishment, are you not?" His voice was high and nasal, his face pinched into a ferocious squint as he tried to focus on Henry through the reading glasses. Henry stopped and turned to face his employer. Yes, of course, Mr. Colloyd. 8 o'clock. Is it past that now?" Henry was sure he'd arrived on time. Mr. Colloyd's mouth curled up into a victorious sneer as he flicked the top off his pocket watch again, examining it closely for several seconds. "Simply being in one's place of employ is not to begin work, boy," he said eventually. "The time is now precisely 40 seconds past the hour of 8, and you have yet to count a single piece of gold." Henry stood in the middle of the room, all eyes on him. "Well, I've been standing here talking to you for about 40 seconds, otherwise I would have done." Injustice coloured his cheeks. Mr. Colloyd gasped, snapping the watch shut and levelling his gaze on the young man. But the short-distance lenses in his glasses, which were in a particularly mischievous mood, hiked his aim off to the right 10 degrees, and he wound up glaring at a table instead. The table shook nervously. Mr. Colloyd snatched the treacherous glasses off their perch and stalked around his desk towards Henry, snarling, "You are sailing perilously close to the edge of your world, Sonny. I should hate you to fall off." Somehow, Henry doubted that. I'm sorry, Mr. Colloyd, but—" His attempt at an explanation was brought to an abrupt halt by the clatter of coins bouncing across the stone floor. This sound was quickly followed by the frantic rustling of cloth as someone tried to cover it up. Mr. Colloyd's head whipped around, and he glared at the red-faced clerk who'd caused the commotion. "Cosset!" he roared. Peter Cosset shrank back into his soft leather boots, cradling the wayward coins in his tunic as he cowered at the edge of the room. I'm sorry, Mr. Colloyd," he stuttered. Seeing his chance, Henry scurried to his station, settling down and immediately starting the process of transferring towers of glittering gold coins from one side of the bench to the other. "Oh, you will be, boy." Mr. Colloyd's sneer broadened into a smug smile. "When you find your remuneration for today to be 5 shekels light." He finished with a strangled squawk that roughly resembled a laugh and curled spiny fingers into the turn of his lapels. His icy eyes focused on the cowering accounts clerk, which, without the interference of the troublesome reading glasses, marked their target with devastating accuracy. Peter went back to studying the coins in the scoop of his tunic, and eventually the chief accountant stalked back to his desk. Henry felt sorry for Peter. The bullying overseer made him so nervous he was all thumbs and 2 left feet. He'd only been working in the vaults for a month and had already been docked 25 shekels. Much more, and the poor lad would be paying to come to work. Henry watched as Peter pulled himself together, pouring the errant coins in his tunic onto a long wooden bench in front of one of the busily counting accountants. He dug in his pocket, pulled out a white handkerchief, and blew his nose gently. Dabbing at his nostrils fussily, he noticed Henry watching him. He blushed and folded the hanky neatly away into his pocket, then went back to collecting stray coins. "Never mind, hey, Peter?" Henry whispered as the young lad appeared from beneath his bench, clutching the last few runaways. "He's probably just having a bad day. Wouldn't you if you had to look at that face in the mirror every morning?" The clerk's mouth gaped in horror, his eyes flicking between Henry and Mr. Colloyd from behind a mop of unruly hair that seemed to sprout in every direction, despite evidence of an attempt to tame it with rather too much hair cream. "Shh, Henry, he'll hear you. My mother will ground me for life if I lose any more shekels this month." Henry clamped shut his mouth. That was a feeling he knew only too well. Expected to work like a man down here, yet still treated like a child at home. Perhaps he had something in common with one of his colleagues after all. Peter sniffed and put the back of his hand to his forehead, seeming to test its temperature. "You okay?" Henry asked with genuine concern. Peter blinked. "Yes, sorry, I'm fine." He tried on a tentative smile. Henry smiled back encouragingly. I'll go get some more coins." Then Peter scampered off towards the lower vaults. Henry looked at his bench. Light from the paraffin lamps on the walls danced across the glittering stacks of gold. He went back to counting and allowed his mind to wander through the hypnotic patterns they cast on the worktop, his imagination transforming the light display into swirling garlands of magic he commanded to do his bidding. A shard of light here to fix his family's money troubles, a shaft of brilliance there to bring his father back, and a blade of pink luminescence spun across the room to turn his employer into a toad. A chuckle rose in his throat as he imagined tossing the nasty man into a pond with all the other slimy creatures. His imaginary spellcasting was broken when a shadow fell across the work surface, killing the shimmering reflections. "Count!" Bob Frugal's chalk was poised above the grey slate cradled in his arm. Henry's face remained blank. "Count!" Bob repeated, an edge of irritation creeping in. "Henry, for heaven's sake, what count do you have?" Henry glanced down at the stack of coins laid out on the desk in front of him, his face growing hot as the awful truth dawned. He had completely lost count. An entire morning's work wasted. Mr. Colloyd was going to have his head on an abacus.